restaurant stimulus has arrived after months, maybe almost a year of the industry taking some pretty hard hits. My name is Paul Barron. This is the Barron Report. We're going to dive into the restaurant stimulus today and kind of how this is affecting or could affect the restaurant industry as a whole when you look at the kind of what the program is going to be dealing with. First up is that it is a $28.6 billion stimulus. This, of course, is going to be devoted to restaurants that are under 20 units. This is where it gets a little complicated. Under 20 units, and there's going to be some caps on it. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But the under 20 unit topic is one that is kind of interesting, because if you're an independent restaurant, when you look at the numbers of about 880,000 restaurants pre the event, now we've lost, according to the NRA, around 100,000. We think that's somewhere in the 160 range. So let's just say that we're somewhere in the range of around 700,000 total restaurants that are remaining in the industry or in the United States. If you look at the 700,000 restaurants, what percentage of those would be eligible is the question, because if I'm a McDonald's franchisee and only have 15 units, technically I would be eligible because I'm running a separate LLC or a separate corporation as an operation and could be eligible for this stimulus check. If you are a multi-unit franchisee, most likely once you're over the 20 unit count, definitely not the scenario unless you filed independent LLCs or independent companies within your organization to keep all of your tax records and your cost models in place. And a lot of restaurant operators do that. They actually set up different entities for each individual business in many cases. Now, there are a few that do not, and they do go the more all-inclusive route. But the fact that we are going to see this for the smaller Main Street operator, meaning the independent restaurant, this will be interesting to see how it's going to go. Just so you kind of understand, one thing that we calculated was this is going to end up somewhere around $40,000 per eligible restaurant. The question is going to be who's going to get the average. So you're going to have companies out there are gaining more because of their loss differences between 2019 and 2020. There's a lot of variables as to when you can actually, or when you can actually start calculating your losses if you were in business in 2019, pre-2019, and even if you opened in 2020. So there's a lot of things to unpack. But when you look at this overall program, it's unlike the Paycheck Protection Program, which is kind of saddled most restaurants with one, accountability, and if you didn't spend it right, you would be eligible for a loan back to the SBA for your PPP money. That's not the case with these. These are true grants. Now, the question I would ask to any attorney or tax attorney that's out there listening right now is, does this qualify for tax exempt under like what most grants do? If you are doing something for public good, then you essentially fall under a non-taxable grant. My argument would be if you're doing something for public good for a small restaurant operator, you're probably keeping employees, which would be a public good, or at least I would look at it that way. I'd be interested to get, so if any attorneys are out there or tax specialists that could help us answer that. I know we're still getting more and more data coming in on this program. As we get more, probably will get more complicated. But the big thing here, and probably the number one thing and takeaway from this video, is you guys need to get on this now. The likelihood is this number is going to fall well short of what the industry is going to need. This is a small percentage of the overall loss in revenue. And if you look at the industry, which was pre-19 or in 2019, we were in, I guess the difference here, yeah, it's about a $33 billion gap just in a single month in the industry, $33 billion gap. So if you look at this over a year, now you're talking about almost maybe $360 billion. So this only being about 10%. And really the loss or the gap in sales decline is what the factor is for you to be able to apply to get the funds. So if you let's say you had a sales of 1.1 million and in 2020 your sales dropped down to 500,000, technically you'd be available, or you could apply for a $600,000 grant to accommodate and help equal or balance out your revenues. So just to kind of go through the rest of this in terms of where this is going to be hitting. Over $5 billion will be set aside for smaller venues whose annual gross sales receipts were below 500,000, leaving about $23.6 billion for everybody else. They'll be capped at 10 million for restaurant groups that are 5 million for individual venues. So this will include the Save Our Stages program that was kind of out there pushing for entertainment venues. Publicly traded companies or restaurants with more than 20 locations, as I said, will not be eligible. And then for the first 21 days, establishments owned by women, veterans, or economically and socially disadvantaged groups will be prioritized. This will be interesting how they apply or how they can determine that, because that's going to be complicated in itself. And then if a restaurant has received a PPP loan, that amount will be subtracted from your potential grant amount. So that's coming right off the top of your grant amount. The funds must be used by the end of the year, so you've got to be able to turn this around. I'm assuming that most of that money is going to go either toward maintaining employees, reopening restaurants, trying to deal with a lot of the PPP costs, or excuse me, personal protection gear costs that you need in an operation to kind of keep things going. How much is your business eligible for? Now, I'm going to put a link down below that there is a worksheet available that kind of can walk you through this to kind of look at your situation where there's a prior to 2019, when you opened your business, during 2019, and then during 2020, that you can kind of calculate. There are some scenarios here that I think for the industry as a whole that we really need to kind of unpack a little bit. The first thing is the group that was behind this was the Independent Restaurant Coalition, which was surprising to me because I felt like the state associations and the National Restaurant Association would have been kind of the leader on this. The difference is this was really going after the independent restaurant operator chefs, which were mostly in this program, that were really supporting this. And we've had several of them on this show right here to talk about how this potentially could bail the industry out. At 28 billion, I don't think this is going to bail the industry out. It's going to fall short after looking at these numbers and really kind of what is going to happen here. The bigger picture here is who is really lobbying for the restaurant industry? Who is out there really pushing to try to get this type of stimulus in play? And how do we deal with government in the future as an industry that used to be $1 trillion industry? We will see that again. It was at one time the #2 employer in the United States as well, at over 15 million people. That, of course, has now been severely damaged in terms of the overall numbers. But this is something that I think every operator that's in business today, restaurant operator, needs to ask themselves is who should they be working with and supporting as organizations, because this is going to be an important issue that we need as an operator or as an industry moving forward and being able to kind of go to the next level, especially in Capitol Hill. We're going to need and have to have representation up there that is really going to be pushing out for, I think, what is the largest sector in the restaurant industry, and that is the independent restaurant operator. I want to talk about some potential cons here, and there's a lot of them. First is a small business admin, SBA. They'll award grants equitably, but on a first come, first served basis, something that could give larger restaurants kind of an edge on this. And what I mean by that is, listen, you've got 10 units, all right? You've got some infrastructure in your 10-unit operation. You probably have an accountant or a CPA that can really help you kind of pull this together very quickly. You've probably got administrative staff that can help you get this moving in very fast. And the likelihood is, because this is such a small amount, I know that sounds weird at 28 billion, but because when you think about $1 trillion industry, and which lost 10 times that in just 1 year, then it's not so much. But when you look at being able to get to that money quickly, it's going to be, I think, going to be the larger organizations, unless, of course, it's an operator that is barely hanging on and he's got nothing but time on his hand. That is another scenario that could happen. Program does not appear to allocate specific funds for hard-hit regions. This is another one that I think is bad, because New York was clearly one of the hardest hit in the country, and especially if you look at the city of Chicago. Chicago was absolutely decimated inside the inner loop, and these are independent restaurants, whether you're looking at Abe Conlon or Steph Izard, all of these great chefs that really were impacted by what was happening there in Chicago. This is another one that I think really needed to kind of zone in on these, on kind of like FEMA does when you have natural disasters, really kind of earmarking a certain amount of funds for that. So I think that was a bit of a miss. 28.6 billion again, down from the initial ask. Guess what the initial ask was? $120 billion. So we end up getting basically what is that, 25% of the original ask. If we assume that every low revenue restaurant applying needs 250,000, the $5 billion set aside for that group would only take care of about 20,000 restaurants. That's a very, very small amount. It also would take less than 5,000 restaurants requesting 5 million to hit the limit. Remember that the limit on what you can request is 10 million. So let's just say you cut that in half. This is still a very small number, and there's almost 700,000 restaurants throughout the country in the years. Actually, it was 880,000, but around 700,000 now we think that are left and able to be able to potentially qualify for this money. If you look at the difference, and this is, I'm going to show a chart up on screen. If you look at the difference between the 2019 numbers and kind of where the fall off was on revenue, that's what we're talking about. And that's where the $33 billion gap happens, which was only for 1 month. And that continued to compound until towards the end of 2020, we did start to see some recovery because restaurants were figuring out how to do takeout and delivery, which helped offset the numbers versus in the first few months, it was literally just every restaurant lost about 90% of their revenue or maybe even more. So that in itself is another indication that the industry is still in dire straits in terms of where the money is going to come from to help sustain this. Now, I will argue this, and that is that though the end of 2020, we started to see restaurants recover. And when I say recover, meaning their numbers were starting to come back in the sense because of their takeout and delivery programs that they put into play that actually got these businesses in some cases comping positive. And that, if that were to occur, then that can kind of offset the differences between the overall loss of what 360 billion in 2020. We'll see how kind of all this shakes out and really where it comes from. But I think what we are going to see in the coming months in terms of news stories is a lot of talk about not enough stimulus here, which is, it's expected. Here's the problem that I see, and that is that I don't think that the administration is going to go back and reassess this at any point in a later date. I think this was our one shot at a stimulus program for the restaurant business, and this is what we got. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I think this is unfortunately going to continue to put a lot of restaurant operators that were not able to leap into takeout and delivery as a primary source of income. It's probably going to put those guys in a position to maybe recover, or it's just going to be enough for them to pay off their existing debts and close their doors, which is definitely not the scenario. And of course, the accountability is another factor that I think is going to be very interesting because there doesn't seem to be much of accountability here. I think what will happen here is we'll get a lot of follow-up information on this program and what applies, where your regulations are, how you can potentially, because normally when you file for a grant, there's just an unbelievable amount of workload, especially if you're doing something like this. Now, maybe they're making those grants easier to access because of the scenario. So I think that's going to be a big factor. But again, back to one of the points I made earlier, and that is, will it be taxable? If it is not taxable, this is essentially, that would be an unbelievable precedence of something like this. Now, that's going to be the category of where does this kind of grant fall? Does it fall in the doing public good side of things, where you're keeping people employed, you're maintaining an ecosystem in the local community, or does it purely fall into a business grant, which potentially could come in as income? And obviously, this is something you guys need to know. So again, like I said, I'll put a how-to guide link in the description so that can hopefully help you get a better grasp out of this. But I think the first thing you should be doing is contacting your CPAs, get a hold of your tax attorneys, and even your attorney for your organization. If you don't have one, I would recommend a handful that you could go out to. Hit me up on Twitter at Paul Barron, and I'll point you to a few that can kind of get you in that direction. This is going to be a very sensitive time for a lot of operators, and it's going to be one of those things that are going to have more questions than probably answers. as we get more information coming in, what we'll do is try to keep you guys updated here on more and more of this stimulus update as we get more answers. And also, I'm going to reach out to my network that work with us on answering some of these questions, because there's a lot of questions on how this is going to work and how it's going to affect your business in the coming months or maybe in the next year. Hopefully, this is something, though, that's going to help you maintain some people in your organization, get yourself and your operation back on track, and hopefully recover outside of where we've been over the last year. So make sure and stay tuned right here. If you have an idea that you want to hear about here on the Barron Report, make sure and send us a note to producer@foodabletv.com. And of course, you can always hit me up on Twitter, as I said, just @PaulBarron. Again, if you're subscribing to us over on the podcast, make sure and leave us a review, write a note, and also give us a rating. If you're over on YouTube, make sure and subscribe and make sure and hit the bell, because you will get notified of content like this. And hopefully this is something that can help you in your operation on a day in, day out basis. We'll catch you next time right here on the Barron Report.